in the tranquil village of Netherby Green, a grand estate hides a deadly secret. When Miss Jane Marple arrives at Blackthorn Hall for a weekend of genteel games, a treasure hunt in a shadowy ivy maze turns sinister. A charming art dealer lies dead, a trowel in his chest, and whispers of a lost masterpiece, the verdant Madonna, stir greed and fear among the guests. With her quiet wisdom, Miss Marple unravels lies, navigates hidden paths, and sets a cunning trap to reveal a killer whose obsession turned a garden into a grave. Can she solve the maze's mystery before another life is lost? Chapter 1. The Invitation to Blackthorn Hall. In the tranquil village of Netherby Green, where the hedgerows bloomed with late summer roses, and the church bell tolled with reassuring regularity, Miss Jane Marple sat in her modest sitting room at Rose Cottage. Her nimble fingers worked a pair of knitting needles, coaxing a soft blue shawl into existence, while her sharp eyes occasionally lifted to the window, where the world beyond seemed as orderly as her stitches. Netherby Green was not unlike other villages she knew, its quiet surface rippled by the undercurrents of human nature, which Miss Marple understood better than most. The Morning Post, delivered by young Tommy Pierce with his usual cheerful whistle, brought an unexpected letter. It was written on thick, creamy paper, embossed with the crest of Blackthorn Hall, and penned in the elegant, if slightly flamboyant, hand of Lady Beatrice Harrow. Beatrice, a friend from Miss Marple's school days at a genteel academy in Florence, had always possessed a flair for the dramatic. Now a widow, she presided over Blackthorn Hall, a Georgian manor on the outskirts of the village, its ivy-draped walls and mullioned windows lending it an air of timeless mystery. The letter invited Miss Marple to a weekend gathering, promising delightful company, fine weather, and a touch of intrigue, in the form of a newly restored maze on the estate grounds. "Do come, Jane," Beatrice wrote, "for I suspect your clever mind will find much to amuse it." Miss Marple, though fond of her routine, felt a stir of curiosity. Beatrice's words hinted at something unspoken, and Miss Marple had learned to trust such hints. She penned a polite acceptance, packed a small valise with practical attire, and arranged for her neighbour, Mrs. Clement, to tend her roses. By Friday afternoon she was driven by the local taxi to Blackthorn Hall, where the gravel drive crunched underfoot and the air carried the scent of cut grass and old stone. Lady Beatrice greeted her at the door, her silver hair swept into an elegant chignon, her smile as bright as ever but tinged with a nervous energy. "Jane, my dear, how good of you to come," she exclaimed, ushering Miss Marple into a grand hall adorned with portraits of stern Harrow ancestors. Over tea in the drawing-room, with its chintz curtains and polished mahogany, Beatrice introduced the other guests, a curiously assorted group that piqued Miss Marple's interest at once. There was Major Ernest Caldwell, a retired officer with a weathered face and a habit of barking his words as if addressing troops. His moustache bristled as he complained about the damp, though his eyes darted about the room, assessing each occupant. Clara Voss, a novelist whose detective stories had gained a modest following, sat with a notebook in hand, her sharp tongue and sharper gaze suggesting she missed little. Dr. Leonard Price, a botanist with a thin frame and ink-stained fingers, spoke passionately of the estate's rare plants, though his enthusiasm seemed to mask a private preoccupation. Evelyn Harrow, Beatrice's niece, was a pale young woman of 25, her delicate features marred by a tendency to fidget, her eyes avoiding direct contact. Lastly, Rupert Langley, an art dealer with a charming smile and an air of calculated vagueness, arrived late, apologizing profusely as he lugged a heavy suitcase up the stairs. As the group sipped tea and nibbled cucumber sandwiches, Beatrice unveiled the weekend centerpiece. The Ivy Maze, a labyrinth of yew and stone recently restored to its 18th century design. "It's quite the marvel," she declared, her eyes gleaming. "Tomorrow we shall have a treasure hunt within its twists and turns, a game to test your wits." The guests murmured polite enthusiasm, but Miss Marple noted undercurrents. Clara's sceptical smirk, Major Caldwell's dismissive grunt, and Evelyn's sudden pallor, as if the maze held some unspoken dread. Dinner that evening was a formal affair, with candlelight glinting off crystal and silver. The conversation, however, crackled with tension. Clara made a pointed remark about Rupert's dubious taste in art, to which he responded with a laugh too smooth to be genuine. Major Caldwell, after one too many glasses of claret, alluded to a past encounter with Rupert in Cairo, his tone suggesting unresolved grievances. Dr. Price, absorbed in describing a rare fern, seemed oblivious to the friction, yet Miss Marple caught him glancing at Evelyn, who barely touched her food. Beatrice, ever the gracious hostess, steered the talk to lighter topics, but her laughter rang a touch too shrill. As the evening drew to a close, Miss Marple retired to her room, a cosy chamber overlooking the darkened grounds. She sat by the window, her knitting untouched, her mind sifting through the day's observations. The guests, she mused, were like characters in one of Clara's novels, each with secrets tucked beneath their polished exteriors. The maze, with its promise of hidden treasures, seemed a fitting stage for whatever drama was brewing. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, her thoughts as precise as her stitches. Something was afoot at Blackthorn Hall, and she intended to unravel it. Chapter 2. The Body in the Maze. The morning dawned over Netherby Green with a sky the colour of a tarnished silver, casting a muted light over Blackthorn Hall's sprawling grounds. Miss Jane Marple, ever an early riser, sat on a cushioned bench near the entrance to the Ivy Maze, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on her pale blue shawl. The maze itself loomed before her, a dense labyrinth of meticulously trimmed yew hedges interwoven with thick curtains of ivy, its paths disappearing into shadowed twists that seemed to whisper secrets. Lady Beatrice Harrow had orchestrated a treasure hunt for her guests, a playful diversion meant to showcase the restored Georgian marvel. But Miss Marple, with her instinct for the undercurrents of human behaviour, had chosen to observe rather than participate. Her sharp eyes, framed by delicate spectacles, missed nothing as the guests gathered, clutching their maps and clues with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Lady Beatrice, resplendent in a tweed skirt and a silk scarf, stood at the maze's arched entrance, her voice carrying a theatrical lilt as she explained the rules. Each guest was to follow a unique clue leading to a hidden trinket. A silver locket, she said, tucked somewhere within the maze's heart. Major Ernest Caldwell adjusted his cap with a grunt, his military bearing undiminished by the civilian setting. Clara Voss, the novelist, scribbled in her ever-present notebook, her lips curled in a skeptical smile as if she found the game beneath her. Dr. Leonard Price, the botanist, seemed more interested in the maze's flora than the hunt, his fingers brushing the ivy as he murmured Latin names. Evelyn Harrow, Beatrice's niece, clutched her map with trembling hand, her eyes darting nervously towards the dark green walls. Rupert Langley, the art dealer, arrived last, his charming smile a touch strained as he apologized for oversleeping. Miss Marple noted the faint perspiration on his brow despite the cool morning air. At precisely 10 o'clock, Beatrice clapped her hands and the guests dispersed into the maze, their footsteps crunching on the gravel paths before fading into silence. Miss Marple settled back, her needles moving rhythmically, her mind alert to the subtle discord she had sensed at dinner the previous night. The maze, with its high walls and hidden corners, was a perfect stage for secrets to unravel, or for something darker to emerge. She recalled Clara's barbed comment about Rupert's dubious business dealings, Major Caldwell's veiled reference to a past grievance, and Evelyn's unexplained anxiety. Even Dr. Price's botanical obsession seemed to mask a deeper preoccupation. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a piercing scream that shattered the morning's quiet, echoing from the maze's depths like a cry from another world. The scream came from Evelyn. Miss Marple rose swiftly, her shawl slipping to the bench, and hurried toward the maze's entrance as the other guests emerged, drawn by the sound. Evelyn stumbled out, her face ashen, her hands clutching her skirt. "A body!" she gasped, her voice trembling. "In there! Rupert! He's dead!" Her words dissolved into sobs as Beatrice, pale but composed, took her niece's arm and urged the group to follow. Major Caldwell led the way, his stride purposeful despite a slight limp, while Clara and Dr. Price trailed behind, exchanging wary glances. Miss Marple, unhurried but alert, followed at the rear, her eyes scanning the ground for any telltale signs. Evelyn guided them through the maze's twisting paths to a secluded clearing, where the ivy hung in heavy drapes, casting dappled shadows. There, sprawled on the mossy ground, lay Rupert Langley, his once charming face frozen in a grimace of shock. A gardening trowel, its blade stained with blood, protruded from his chest, pinning him to the earth like a grim specimen. His eyes stared upward, as if fixed on the ivy above, and his hands lay limp, one clutching a crumpled map. Dr. Price, with a physician's instinct, knelt beside the body, his thin fingers probing for a pulse. "He's gone," he said quietly, his voice steady but his eyes flickering with unease. "Dead within the hour, I'd wager. The wound is fresh." Beatrice stifled a cry, her hand flying to her mouth, while Evelyn sank to her knees sobbing. Major Caldwell muttered something about damned foul play, his face flushed with indignation. Clara, oddly composed, jotted notes in her book, her pen moving with the precision of a surgeon. Miss Marple, standing slightly apart, observed the scene with her characteristic calm, her mind already sifting through details. The trowel, she noted, was of the sort kept in the gardener's shed, accessible to anyone familiar with the estate. The clearing, hidden deep within the maze, suggested the killer knew its layout well. And Rupert's map, clutched in his hand, bore a faint smudge of ink, not from the printed clues, but something else entirely. Constable Hodges, a young man with an earnest demeanour but limited experience, arrived shortly after, summoned by a breathless footman. His round face flushed with the weight of responsibility as he surveyed the scene. "Nobody touch anything," he ordered, his voice wavering slightly. He turned to Beatrice, who confirmed that no one had left the estate since breakfast. Hodges, clearly out of his depth, welcomed Miss Marple's quiet suggestion to secure the maze and question the guests. She remained unobtrusive. Her grey head bowed as if in thought, but her ears caught every word as the group recounted their movements. Major Caldwell claimed he'd been near the maze's eastern edge, following his clue, and had seen no one. Clara said she'd wandered a western path, alone, her muddy gloves suggesting she'd brushed against the damp earth. Dr. Price admitted to lingering near a cluster of rare ivy, though he swore he hadn't ventured near the clearing. Evelyn, still shaken, insisted she'd stumbled upon Rupert by chance while searching for her trinket, her path taking her deeper than intended. Each account was plausible, yet Miss Marple noted inconsistencies. Major Caldwell's boots bore scratches too fresh for a casual stroll, and Clara's gloves, though muddy, seemed oddly clean at the fingertips. Evelyn's map, unlike Rupert's, was pristine, and Dr. Price's coat pocket bulged slightly, as if concealing something small. As Hodges organised a search of the maze's perimeter, Miss Marple returned to her bench, retrieving her shawl and resuming her knitting. Her needles moved steadily, but her mind was far from idle. Rupert's death, she mused, was no random act. The trowel suggested premeditation, yet the choice of weapon hinted at opportunity. Had Rupert been lured to the clearing, or had he stumbled upon his killer? And what of the ink smudge on his map? Could it point to a clue beyond the treasure hunt? Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the tensions she'd observed. Clara's disdain for Rupert, Major Caldwell's cryptic grudge, Evelyn's fear, and Dr. Price's guarded demeanour. The maze, with its labyrinthine paths, was a mirror of the human heart, full of hidden turns and dark corners. As the constable's men combed the grounds, Miss Marple knew the truth lay not in the maze's greenery, but in the motives of those who had entered it. Chapter 3. The Art Dealer's Secrets. The afternoon sun struggled to pierce the heavy clouds over Blackthorn Hall, casting a pallid light across the estate as Constable Hodges and his men secured the ivy maze. Inside the manor the atmosphere was thick with unease, the guests confined to the drawing-room under the watchful eye of a young policeman. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, her knitting needles moving with their usual precision, though her eyes darted keenly from one guest to another. The shock of Rupert Langley's murder lingered, and the air bristled with unspoken accusations and guarded glances. Lady Beatrice Harrow, ever the dutiful hostess despite her ashen complexion, poured tea with trembling hands, her attempts at conversation faltering under the weight of the morning's horror. Major Ernest Caldwell paced near the window, his boots clicking on the polished floor, muttering about the inefficiency of rural constables. Clara Voss, the novelist, sat with her notebook closed for once. Her sharp eyes narrowed as she studied the room. Dr. Leonard Price, the botanist, fidgeted with a pocket magnifying glass, his thin lips pressed tightly together. Evelyn Harrow, Beatrice's niece, huddled on a sofa, clutching a handkerchief, her eyes red-rimmed but alert. Miss Marple, unobtrusive as ever, noted the subtle shifts in their postures, defensive, wary, or perhaps guilty. Constable Hodges, his notebook filled with scribbled statements, sought Miss Marple's counsel in a quiet corner. "Miss Marple, you've a reputation for seeing things clearly," he said, his voice low. "This is beyond me. A murder in a maze, no witnesses, and all these fine folk claiming they were alone. I'd value your thoughts." Miss Marple, with a modest smile, suggested they examine Rupert's belongings for any clue to his killer's motive. Hodges nodded gratefully and, with Lady Beatrice's permission, led the way to the guest wing. Rupert's room was tidy, almost too orderly, as if he'd anticipated scrutiny. His heavy suitcase, which had piqued Miss Marple's curiosity upon his arrival, stood in the corner. Hodges opened it, revealing not clothes, but a collection of art catalogues, auction records, and a locked leather journal. The constable, with a small crowbar, pried it open, revealing pages filled with Rupert's precise handwriting. The entries detailed his search for the Verdant Madonna, a lost Renaissance painting rumoured to depict the Virgin Mary in a garden of emerald hues, its value astronomical due to its rarity. Rupert's notes suggested he believed it was hidden at Blackthorn Hall, possibly uncovered during the maze's restoration. One entry, dated days before, read, "B knows more than she admits. E is the key. Must act swiftly." Miss Marple's mind quickened. The Verdant Madonna was no mere trinket. It was a motive for murder. Had Rupert's pursuit of the painting led to his death? She recalled the tensions at dinner, Clara's disdain for Rupert's shady dealings, Major Caldwell's allusion to a past betrayal, and Evelyn's nervous avoidance of the art dealer's questions. Dr. Price's obsession with the maze's flora now seemed suspiciously convenient, given the painting's rumoured connection to the estate's gardens. Hodges, puzzled by the journal, questioned the guests about the painting. Lady Beatrice, her voice strained, dismissed the Verdant Madonna as a family legend, a tale her late husband had loved but never proven. "It's nonsense," she said, though her fingers twisted her pearls tightly. Clara, however, spoke with unexpected authority, describing the painting's history, its creation by a lesser-known Florentine master, its disappearance during a 17th century theft. Rupert was obsessed with such things, she added, her tone laced with contempt. He'd sell his soul for a masterpiece. Miss Marple noted Clara's knowledge, wondering if her novel's research extended to real-world art theft. Major Caldwell scoffed at the idea of hidden treasure, claiming he'd known Rupert in Cairo during a murky antiquities deal that left him out of pocket. "The man was a rogue," he growled, his moustache twitching. Evelyn, when pressed, admitted Rupert had quizzed her about the estate's history, particularly the maze, but she swore she knew nothing of any painting. Her wide eyes, however, betrayed a flicker of fear, as if Rupert's questions had stirred a deeper unease. Dr. Price, absorbed in examining a fern on the windowsill, claimed ignorance of art, saying he'd been in the maze to study its rare ivy, not to hunt for treasures. Yet Miss Marple's gaze lingered on his coat pocket, where the bulge she'd noticed earlier had vanished, replaced by a faint green stain on his cuff. As the questioning ended, Miss Marple suggested Hodges secure the journal and catalogues as evidence, then excused herself to stroll the terrace, her shawl draped over her shoulders. The maze loomed in the distance, its dark green walls a silent witness to the crime. She pondered the journal's cryptic reference to E. Surely Evelyn, but why was she the key? And Beatrice's denial of the painting's existence rang hollow. Her nervous gestures suggested she knew more than she admitted. The Verdant Madonna, Miss Marple mused, was the thread connecting Rupert's death to Blackthorn Hall. But was it the prize, or a distraction? She recalled a similar case in Netherby Green years ago, when a young man's greed for a hidden heirloom had led to betrayal. People she knew rarely changed. Greed, fear, or revenge drove them to desperate acts. Clara's expertise hinted at a deeper involvement, perhaps a literary mind turned to darker schemes. Major Caldwell's bitterness suggested a motive rooted in the past. Evelyn's fear might stem from coercion or knowledge she dared not share. And Dr. Price's botanical alibi, so carefully constructed, seemed almost too perfect. Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her presence barely noticed as the guests whispered among themselves. She listened, her ears attuned to the nuances of their words. Clara mentioned a novel she was writing, its plot eerily similar to the Maze's deadly drama. Major Caldwell complained of the constable's incompetence, his voice carrying a hint of bravado. Evelyn, quieter now, murmured to Beatrice about leaving the hall, only to be gently rebuffed. Dr. Price, engrossed in a book on rare plants, seemed detached, yet his fingers twitched as if itching to act. Miss Marple's needles paused as she considered the next step. The journal was a start, but the maze itself held answers, its paths, its hidden corners, its secrets. She resolved to examine it more closely, perhaps under the guise of admiring its design. For now, she let the guests believe her a harmless old lady, her mind merely on her knitting. But within that mind, a picture was forming, as intricate and tangled as the maze itself, and Miss Marple knew that with patience, the truth would emerge from its shadows. Chapter 4. Shadows of Motive. The evening shadows lengthened across Blackthorn Hall, casting intricate patterns on the drawing room's walls, where the guests sat in uneasy silence. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth doing little to dispel the chill of suspicion that had settled over the household since Rupert Langley's murder in the Ivy Maze. Miss Jane Marple, ensconced in her usual chair, her knitting needles moving with quiet precision, observed the group with her deceptively mild gaze. Each guest, she noted, wore their unease differently, like actors in a play yet to reveal its final act. Lady Beatrice Harrow, her composure fraying, busied herself rearranging a vase of roses, her fingers betraying a slight tremor. Major Ernest Caldwell sat stiffly, his hands clasped tightly, as if restraining some inner turmoil. Clara Voss, the novelist, sipped her sherry with a studied calm, though her eyes flicked toward the others with a predator's alertness. Dr. Leonard Price, his botanist's curiosity seemingly undimmed, leafed through a journal on plant pathology, but his foot tapped an anxious rhythm. Evelyn Harrow, pale and withdrawn, clutched a cushion, her gaze fixed on the floor. Miss Marple, ever attuned to the nuances of human behavior, sensed that the murder had stirred secrets long buried, like leaves disturbed by a sudden wind. The revelation of Rupert's journal, with its cryptic notes about the verdant Madonna, had shifted the dynamics of the group, each guest now eyeing the others with a mixture of distrust and calculation. Constable Hodges, though diligent, lacked the experience to unravel such a tangled web, and so Miss Marple, with her gentle suggestions, had become his unofficial confidant. As the clock struck 7, Hodges entered, his face flushed from the cold, to report that the maze had been thoroughly searched, yielding no further clues beyond the bloodied trowel, which bore no fingerprints, a fact that suggested a careful hand. Over dinner, served in the oak-panelled dining room, the conversation was stilted, punctuated by long silences. Beatrice, attempting to lighten the mood, spoke of the maze's history, how her late husband had dreamed of restoring it to its former glory. "He believed it held secrets," she said, her voice catching, "but I never thought they'd be so deadly." Her words hung in the air, and Miss Marple noted the reactions. Major Caldwell's scowl, Clara's raised eyebrow, Evelyn's flinch. Dr. Price, cutting his lamb with precision, remarked that mazes were botanical marvels, their designs often symbolic. A place of concealment, he mused, or revelation. Miss Marple, sipping her soup, wondered if his words carried a deeper meaning. As the meal ended, the guests lingered, reluctant to retire to their rooms. Miss Marple, seizing the moment, gently steered the conversation toward Rupert. "Such a tragedy," she said, her voice soft but deliberate. "He seemed a man with many connections. Did any of you know him well?" The question, innocuous on its surface, elicited a flurry of responses, each revealing more than intended. Clara spoke first, her tone sharp. "I knew him well enough to distrust him," she said. "He swindled my publisher years ago, passing off a forged sketch as a dagger. I warned Beatrice against inviting him." Her words were laced with bitterness, and Miss Marple wondered if her grudge ran deeper than a professional slight. Major Caldwell, his face reddening, admitted to meeting Rupert in Cairo during a murky antiquities deal. "He left me with nothing but debts and a bad name," he growled, his fist clenching. "But I'd not stoop to murder." His vehemence, Miss Marple noted, was almost too emphatic, as if to convince himself as much as the others. Evelyn, her voice barely above a whisper, confessed that Rupert had pressed her for details about Blackthorn Hall's finances, particularly the cost of the maze's restoration. "He hinted he knew something about Aunt Beatrice's affairs," she said, glancing nervously at her aunt. "I told him nothing, but he wouldn't stop asking." Her words trembled with fear, and Miss Marple's mind turned to the journal's reference to E as the key. Was Evelyn hiding knowledge of the verdant Madonna, or was she merely a pawn in Rupert's schemes? Dr. Price, when questioned, claimed only a passing acquaintance with Rupert, limited to discussions about the estate's gardens. He was curious about the maze's flora, he said, adjusting his glasses. "I thought it odd for an art dealer." Miss Marple, recalling the green stain on his cuff, suspected his interest in the maze extended beyond botany. Beatrice, distressed by the revelations, insisted her family had no secrets worth killing for. "The verdant Madonna is a myth," she said firmly, though her eyes avoided Miss Marple's. As the guests dispersed, Miss Marple remained by the fire, her knitting a pretext for reflection. The motives were piling up like leaves in autumn. Clara's grudge, Caldwell's betrayal, Evelyn's fear of blackmail, Price's guarded demeanour. The trowel, a common tool from the gardener's shed, suggested the killer had acted on impulse, yet the absence of fingerprints pointed to calculation. The maze itself, Miss Marple mused, was more than a backdrop. It was a player in the drama. Its restoration, funded by Beatrice's late husband, might have unearthed more than greenery. Had Rupert discovered the painting, or something equally valuable, hidden within its walls? She recalled a case in Netherby Green, where a dispute over a hidden will had led to violence. People, she knew, killed for gain, for revenge, or to protect a secret. The verdant Madonna, whether real or myth, was a catalyst, stirring greed and fear in equal measure. Clara's knowledge of art theft gleaned from her novels, made her a plausible suspect, yet her openness suggested confidence in her alibi. Caldwell's temper hinted at a man capable of sudden violence, but his limp might have slowed him in the maze's twists. Evelyn's fear could mask guilt or innocence, while Price's botanical expertise gave him intimate knowledge of the maze's layout. Miss Marple resolved to learn more about the maze's design. Beatrice had mentioned old plans kept in the library, which might reveal hidden paths or alcoves. She also considered the ink smudge on Rupert's map, a detail yet to be explained. Was it a clue to the painting's location, or a mark left by the killer? As the fire dwindled, Miss Marple folded her knitting, her mind as clear as the patterns she wove. The truth, she knew, lay in the interplay of motive and opportunity, and the maze, with its secrets, would yield them in time. Chapter 5. The Botanist's Clue. The morning after Rupert Langley's murder broke over Blackthorn Hall with a damp mist, cloaking the ivy maze in an ethereal haze that seemed to deepen its mysteries. Miss Jane Marple, having breakfasted early on tea and toast, sat in the library, where Lady Beatrice Harrow had granted her access to the estate's archives. The room, lined with leather-bound volumes and heavy oak shelves, smelled of old paper and wax polish, a fitting sanctuary for secrets. Miss Marple's fingers, usually occupied with knitting, now turned the brittle pages of a folio containing the original plans of the maze, drawn in 1763 by a landscape architect with a penchant for enigma. Her sharp eyes scanned the intricate lines, noting paths and dead ends, but her mind was equally occupied with the human puzzle before her. The previous evening's revelations had sharpened her suspicions. Clara Voss's grudge, Major Ernest Caldwell's old wound, Evelyn Harrow's fear, and Dr. Leonard Price's guarded manner each pointed to possible motives, yet none fully explained the calculated brutality of the trowel in Rupert's chest. The verdant Madonna, mentioned in Rupert's journal, loomed as a tantalizing thread, but Miss Marple suspected the truth lay not only in greed, but in the maze's very structure. To test her theory, she resolved to visit the maze again, this time with Dr. Price, whose botanical expertise might unwittingly reveal more than he intended. She found him in the conservatory, peering through a magnifying glass at a sprig of ivy he'd collected from the maze. His thin frame was hunched, his eyes intense, as if the plant held answers to questions unasked. "Dr. Price," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but purposeful, "I'd so appreciate a tour of the maze's flora. Beatrice speaks highly of your knowledge." Flattered, he agreed, and they set off, Miss Marple's sensible shoes crunching on the gravel path, her shawl draped against the morning chill. The maze, still cordoned off by Constable Hodges's orders, was quiet, its yew hedges looming like silent sentinels. Dr. Price, warming to his subject, spoke of Hedera obscura, a rare ivy found only in the clearing where Rupert had died. "It's unique," he said, his voice animated. "Its sap, if mishandled, causes a rash, quite irritating." Miss Marple, feigning curiosity, asked if such a plant could mark clothing or skin. Price hesitated, his fingers brushing his cuff, where the green stain she'd noticed yesterday had faded but not vanished. "Possibly," he said, "but one would need to handle it carelessly." His tone was cautious, and Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of his jaw. As they reached the fatal clearing, now marked by a faint outline where Rupert's body had lain, Miss Marple paused, her eyes scanning the ivy. She recalled Clara's muddy gloves, now suspiciously clean, and Evelyn's untouched hands, which suggested she hadn't grappled with the maze's foliage. Major Caldwell's scratched boots hinted at a struggle, but his limp made swift movement through the maze unlikely. Dr. Price, however, navigated the paths with ease, his steps sure, as if he knew every turn by heart. "You've studied this maze thoroughly," Miss Marple remarked, her tone admiring. Price nodded, mentioning his surveys during the restoration, but his eyes flickered, as if wary of her scrutiny. Returning to the hall, Miss Marple requested the maze's plans from Beatrice, who fetched them with a weary smile. The yellowed parchment revealed a hidden alcove, unmarked on the guests' treasure hunt maps, tucked deep within the maze's western quadrant. Intrigued, Miss Marple slipped away after lunch, citing a need for fresh air, and ventured into the maze alone. The paths were narrower than she'd expected, the ivy brushing her shoulders as she followed the plan's directions. At last, she reached the alcove, a small recess concealed by a curtain of vines. Inside was a stone niche, its surface scuffed, as if something, a box perhaps or a canvas, had been recently removed. The verdant Madonna, she thought, or something equally coveted. Back in the library, Miss Marple pondered the alcove's significance. Had Rupert found it, only to meet his killer there? The trowel, wiped clean of prints, suggested a murderer who knew the maze's secrets as well as Price did. She recalled a case in Netherby Green, where a gardener's tool had been used to settle a dispute over land, the weapon chosen for its convenience. Here, the trowel pointed to someone familiar with the estate's routines, perhaps someone who'd helped with the restoration. Constable Hodges, joining her for a brief consultation, reported that the trowel matched those in the gardener's shed, accessible to all but rarely used by guests. No prints, no traces, he sighed. It's as if the killer vanished into the maze. Miss Marple, her eyes twinkling, suggested the alcove might hold answers. "Check for signs of disturbance," she said, but discreetly. Hodges nodded, grateful for her clarity, and promised to investigate. As evening approached, Miss Marple joined the guests in the drawing room, where tension simmered beneath polite conversation. Clara, her pen moving again, spoke of a novel involving a hidden treasure, her words too close to the verdant Madonna for coincidence. Major Caldwell, nursing a brandy, grumbled about Rupert's dishonesty, his anger tinged with something deeper, regret perhaps. Evelyn, quieter now, sat beside Beatrice, her hands still unmarred by dirt or sap. Dr. Price, engrossed in a botanical text, seemed detached, yet Miss Marple noticed his fingers pause when the maze was mentioned. Her thoughts turned to the alcove's scuffed niche. If the verdant Madonna had been hidden there, the killer might have moved it after Rupert's death. Price's knowledge of the maze, his stained cuff, and his ease in its paths made him a compelling figure. Yet Clara's cleaned gloves and Caldwell's scratched boots could not be dismissed. Evelyn's fear, too, suggested she knew more than she admitted, perhaps about the painting or Rupert's intentions. Miss Marple folded her knitting, her mind weaving a pattern from the clues. The maze, she realized, was not just a setting, but a metaphor for the case, its paths converging on a truth hidden in plain sight. She resolved to watch Dr. Price closely, perhaps encouraging him to reveal more through his beloved plants. For now, she remained the quiet spinster, her presence unthreatening, but her mind as sharp as the trowel that had ended Rupert's life. The alcove, she suspected, would draw the killer back, and she intended to be ready when it did. Chapter 6. The Trap is Set. The second evening at Blackthorn Hall descended with a heavy quiet, as if the very walls of the old manor held their breath. The guests, still shaken by Rupert Langley's murder, gathered in the drawing room, where the flickering fire cast long shadows across the polished furniture. Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual corner, her knitting needles clicking softly, her eyes darting over the group with the keenness of a hawk. The air was thick with suspicion, each guest avoiding the other's gazes, their polite exchanges brittle as autumn leaves. Lady Beatrice Harrow, her face drawn, attempted to maintain decorum, offering sherry with a forced smile. Major Ernest Caldwell stood by the window, his silhouette rigid as if bracing for battle. Clara Voss, her novelist's pen idle for once, sipped her drink with a calculating air. Dr. Leonard Price, his fingers stained with ink rather than ivy sap, pored over a botanical sketch, though his eyes flicked nervously to the door. Evelyn Harrow, pale and restless, twisted her handkerchief, her glances toward her aunt laced with unspoken questions. Miss Marple, her mind as sharp as the maze's yew hedges, sensed the killer's confidence growing. The absence of fingerprints on the trowel, the hidden alcove's scuffed niche, and the cryptic references in Rupert's journal to the Verdant Madonna all pointed to a murderer who believed themselves untouchable. Yet she knew from long experience that confidence often bred carelessness. The alcove, she suspected, was the key. Its emptiness suggested the painting had been moved, and the killer would likely return to secure it. To draw them out, a subtle trap was needed, one that played on their fear of discovery. Over dinner, Miss Marple planted the first seed. "Such a pity about the maze," she remarked, her voice mild as she passed the peas. "It's so beautifully restored, yet now it's a place of tragedy. I wonder if anything else lies hidden there." Her words, seemingly innocent, prompted varied reactions. Clara's sharp glance, Caldwell's curt nod, Price's sudden stillness, and Evelyn's quick intake of breath. Beatrice, ever the hostess, murmured about the maze's historical charm, but her eyes betrayed unease. Miss Marple, satisfied, let the topic drop, her trap's foundation laid. After dinner she drew Constable Hodges aside, her tone conspiratorial but gentle. "I believe, Mr. Hodges, that the alcove we discussed may hold more than we found," she said. "If the killer thinks a vital clue remains there, they might act. Perhaps you could let slip that you found something, a scrap of evidence, say, to be retrieved at dawn." Hodges, his earnest face lighting with hope, agreed, trusting Miss Marple's insight. He was a good man, she thought, but lacked the guile to outwit a murderer alone. To set the stage, Hodges gathered the guests in the library, where the maze's plan still lay open. "We've made progress," he announced, his voice steady but loud enough to carry. "A clue in the maze's alcove, something overlooked, will be collected tomorrow morning. It may tell us everything." He left the statement vague, but Miss Marple watched the guests' faces. Clara's lips tightened, Caldwell's moustache twitched, Price's fingers clenched his book, and Evelyn's eyes widened with fear. The bait was set, and Miss Marple, retiring early, positioned herself at her bedroom window, which overlooked the maze's entrance. Her knitting lay untouched as she waited, her eyes fixed on the moonlit path. Hours passed, the house settling into silence. Then, just past midnight, a figure emerged from the shadows, moving stealthily toward the maze. Clad in dark clothing, they slipped through the arched entrance, their steps silent on the gravel. Miss Marple, her heart steady, noted the figure's slight frame and purposeful gait. She did not rouse Hodges yet, preferring to let the trap play out. The killer, she reasoned, would seek the alcove, believing their secret exposed. At dawn, Hodges, acting on Miss Marple's earlier instructions, led a small party to the maze, including the guests who were summoned under the pretense of assisting with the search. Beatrice, pale but composed, joined them, her curiosity outweighing her dread. Miss Marple, her shawl draped over her shoulders, walked at the rear, her eyes scanning for signs of disturbance. As they reached the alcove, Hodges paused, his hand raised for silence. There, partially hidden by ivy, was a small canvas, its edges frayed but its colours vivid. A Madonna in a verdant garden, unmistakably the verdant Madonna. Before anyone could react, Dr. Price stepped forward, his face ashen. "That's it," he murmured, almost to himself, his hand reaching out as if drawn by instinct. Hodges, quick to act, seized his arm. "Dr. Price, you'll come with me," he said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of authority. Price froze, his eyes darting to Miss Marple, who met his gaze with calm certainty. In the library, under Hodges's questioning, Price's composure unravelled. He confessed, his voice breaking, that Rupert had discovered the painting during the maze's restoration, hidden in the alcove's niche. Rupert, sensing its value, had demanded a share to keep silent, threatening to expose Price's plan to sell it on the black market. Price, obsessed with possessing the masterpiece, lured Rupert to the clearing, where a heated argument ended with the trowel, taken from the shed in a moment of panic, plunged into Rupert's chest. He had hidden the painting afterward, intending to retrieve it once suspicion faded. The ivy sprig in his pocket, a careless oversight, had betrayed him. Miss Marple, listening quietly, explained her deductions to Hodges later. Price's familiarity with the maze, gained during its restoration, allowed him to navigate its paths effortlessly. The green stain on his cuff, from Hedera Obscura, placed him in the clearing. Clara's muddy gloves, she noted, were a red herring. She had helped Price with botanical samples, unaware of his crime. Evelyn's fear stemmed from Rupert's attempts to blackmail her about Beatrice's finances, not the painting. Major Caldwell's limp, genuine and limiting, ruled him out of a swift chase through the maze. As Price was led away, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her mind already turning to the next thread in the tapestry of human nature. The maze, she thought, had done its work, revealing not just a painting, but the truth hidden within its twists. Blackthorn Hall would recover, and she would return to Netherby Green, where the village's quiet dramas awaited her discerning eye. Chapter 7. The Maze Reveals. All the dawn light filtered through the mist at Blackthorn Hall, bathing the ivy maze in a soft glow that belied its recent tragedy. The household, roused early by Constable Hodges's summons, gathered at the maze's entrance, their faces etched with a mix of dread and curiosity. Miss Jane Marple stood among them, her shawl neatly draped, her expression serene but her eyes as sharp as ever, missing nothing. Lady Beatrice Harrow, her hands clasped tightly, stood beside her niece Evelyn, whose pallor had softened but whose eyes still darted nervously. Major Ernest Caldwell, his military bearing intact, adjusted his cap with a scowl, while Clara Voss, the novelist, clutched her notebook, her pen poised as if to capture the unfolding drama. Dr. Leonard Price, now under Hodges's scrutiny, stood apart, his thin frame rigid, his gaze fixed on the maze as if it might swallow him whole. The trap, set with Miss Marple's subtle guidance, had worked. Dr. Price's attempt to retrieve the verdant Madonna from the alcove under cover of darkness had exposed him. And now, as Hodges led the group to the hidden recess, the air crackled with anticipation. The alcove, concealed by a curtain of ivy, held the canvas, a small, vibrant painting of a Madonna in a lush garden, its colours undimmed by centuries. Hodges, holding it aloft, declared it evidence, his voice firm but tinged with triumph. Price's face crumpled, his hands trembling as he realized the game was up. Back in the library, with the morning light streaming through the tall windows, Hodges questioned Price before the assembled guests. Miss Marple, seated quietly with her knitting, listened as the botanist's confession poured forth like water from a breached dam. Rupert found the painting during the maze's restoration, Price admitted, his voice low and strained. He knew its value, millions, perhaps, and threatened to expose me unless I shared the profits. I couldn't let him ruin everything. He described luring Rupert to the clearing, claiming it was to discuss the painting's sale. An argument erupted, and in a moment of panic, Price seized a trowel from the nearby shed, striking Rupert fatally. He wiped the handle clean and hid the painting in the alcove, planning to retrieve it when suspicion faded. The sprig of Hedera obscura in his pocket, a careless remnant from the clearing, had been his undoing. Miss Marple, at Hodges's request, clarified her reasoning, her voice soft but precise. Dr. Price's knowledge of the maze was unparalleled, she said, her needles pausing. He'd surveyed it during the restoration, knowing every path and alcove. The green stain on his cuff, from the rare ivy, placed him in the clearing at the time of the murder. She explained how Clara's muddy gloves, initially suspicious, were merely from handling plants for Price, an act of innocent assistance. Evelyn's fear, she noted, stemmed from Rupert's attempts to extract secrets about Beatrice's finances, not the painting. Major Caldwell's limp, confirmed by his uneven gait, made him an unlikely candidate for a swift chase through the maze's twists. Beatrice, her eyes brimming, expressed relief, but also sorrow. I never believed the verdant Madonna was real, she said, but my husband's stories kept the myth alive. I wish I'd known. Evelyn, clinging to her aunt, admitted Rupert's questions had frightened her, hinting at debts she feared might shame the family. Clara, her novelist's instinct piqued, confessed to suspecting Rupert's motives, but denied any role in his death. Caldwell, gruff as ever, muttered about justice served, though his eyes softened as he glanced at Evelyn. Miss Marple, her role complete, folded her knitting as Hodges prepared to escort Price to the village station. The maze, she reflected, had been more than a setting. It was a labyrinth of human desires, its paths leading to greed and desperation. Hume recalled a similar case in Netherby Green, where a hidden treasure had sparked betrayal, proving once again that human nature was the true puzzle, its twists more complex than any maze. As the household dispersed, Beatrice approached Miss Marple, her gratitude evident. "Jane, you've saved us from further shadow," she said, her voice warm. The painting will go to a museum where it belongs." Miss Marple smiled, her thoughts already turning to her quiet cottage. The maze had revealed its secrets, and she, with her unassuming wisdom, had navigated its darkest corners. Chapter 8. The Quiet Return. The sun rose gently over Blackthorn Hall, its rays piercing the morning mist and casting a golden sheen on the ivy maze, now silent and free of its grim secret. The household, though still shaken by the events of the past days, began to stir with a tentative sense of relief. Dr. Leonard Price, his confession secured, had been taken to the village station by Constable Hodges, leaving behind a manner that felt both lighter and heavier for his absence. Miss Jane Marple, her valise packed and her blue shawl neatly folded, prepared to return to Netherby Green, her work here complete. She stood in the hall, her sensible hat adjusted, as Lady Beatrice Harrow, her composure restored but her eyes still shadowed, thanked her profusely. "Jane, you've brought clarity to our darkness," Beatrice said, clasping Miss Marple's hands. "I shudder to think what might have happened without you." She announced her intention to donate the verdant Madonna to the county museum, where it would be admired rather than coveted. The maze, she added, would be replanted with roses, a symbol of renewal rather than secrecy. Miss Marple, with a modest smile, murmured her approval, though her thoughts lingered on the human frailties that had turned a garden game into a tragedy. The other guests, too, were preparing to depart. Major Ernest Caldwell, his brusqueness softened, offered Miss Marple a stiff nod, his earlier suspicions replaced by a grudging respect. "You've a sharp mind, ma'am," he said, his moustache twitching. "Reminds me of my old commander." Clara Voss, her notebook brimming with notes for a new novel, admitted that Miss Marple's insight had inspired her next plot, though she promised to omit the grimmer details. Evelyn Harrow, her nervous demeanour eased, thanked Miss Marple quietly, her relief palpable now that Rupert's shadow no longer loomed over her. "I thought he'd ruin us," she confessed, "but you saw the truth." Miss Marple, ever unassuming, deflected their praise, her thoughts already turning to her rose garden and the familiar rhythms of Netherby Green. The taxi arrived, driven by the cheerful Tommy Pierce, and as she settled into the seat, she gazed one last time at the maze. Its green walls, so imposing days ago, now seemed merely a curiosity, their secrets laid bare. The journey home was short, and soon she was back in her cottage, where the scent of lavender and the ticking of her mantel clock welcomed her. Over tea, Miss Marple reflected on the case. The maze, with its hidden alcove and deadly clearing, had been a stage for human greed, not unlike the petty dramas of her village. Dr. Price's obsession with the verdant Madonna, Rupert's ruthless ambition, and the tangled motives of the others mirrored disputes she'd seen before. A stolen heirloom here, a betrayed trust there. Human nature, she mused, was the true labyrinth, its paths predictable to those who studied its turns. Her knitting resumed, a new scarf taking shape, its pattern as intricate as the case she'd unravelled. By evening, Netherby Green buzzed with whispers of the Blackthorn Hall murder. The story embellished with each retelling. Miss Marple, sipping her tea by the window, smiled faintly at the chatter. She had no need for gossip. The truth, clear and unadorned, was enough. As the village settled into its quiet routine, she picked up her needles, content that the maze's mystery was solved, and ready for whatever puzzle life might next present.